Okay, can you all see that?
Yes, we can.
Okay, awesome. All right, so we want to start first with the land acknowledgement. Much of the work that we're going to be talking about today really is comes from critical scholars and Indigenous scholars, and we think it's fundamentally important that we acknowledge the connections to the land and the peoples that occupy this land. So we will use Colorado State's land acknowledgement. And it says, we acknowledge with respect that the land we are on today is the traditional and ancestral homelands of the Arapaho, Cheyenne, and Ute nations and peoples. This was also a site of trade, gathering, and healing for the numerous other native tribes. We recognize the Indigenous peoples as original stewards of the land and all the relatives within it. As these words of acknowledgement are spoken and heard, the ties nations have to their traditional homelands are renewed and reaffirmed. This acknowledgement is the education and inclusion we must practice in recognizing our history, responsibility, and commitment. And we invite us all to really be grounded in that as we continue the conversation today. Traditionally, assessment has been used to evaluate diversity, equity, and inclusion, so DEI efforts. And it's time to shift the discussion to how do we embed those efforts into the practice of assessment. And while campus labs and other newer scholars and organizations have created more recent content in equity and assessment, we believe it's fundamentally important to note that critical race scholars and Indigenous scholars, as I mentioned, have been problematizing and critiquing the ways that research and assessment has been done for a very long time. So we cannot erase the work of these scholars in this area. It would only perpetuate the systemic racism that we're trying to address. We're going to be going over the Latinx critical race theory, which really allows us to challenge white supremacist ideologies that are embedded in assessment and evaluation. And then we're going to go through an assessment cycle using a Latinx framework. And again, we invite you all to ask questions, to stop us. We have a variety of polls. So we want you to engage and ask questions as we're going through the presentation today. Marianne, you're muted.
Of course I am. So before we get into today's discussion regarding assessment using the LACCRIT framework, we wanted to provide a little bit more information about ourselves, particularly in how we entered this conversation regarding assessment or equity-centered assessment. And so for me, some of my most salient identities are a Latinx queer identified woman. But that's not all of who I am. So prior to my role here at Colorado State University, I have worked at Ames Community College, particularly within the areas of student success and DEI initiatives. I also identify as a scholar practitioner whose focus is on addressing the underpinnings of racism in education, particularly in student success, and how we deconstruct and reimagine student success from a more critical framework. And I would say that, at least for me, and how I approach assessment is through a critical race theory, LACCRIT, and intersectionality. So that is how I entered this particular conversation, but also my work in general.
Thanks, Marianne. Some of my most salient identities and those that influence how I navigate the world and approach my work are being a queer, cisgender Latina Mexicana, raised in the US, but not having citizenship, being a mother, and having the privilege of a bachelor's, a master's, and now being a doctoral student. I was a first-gen graduate and also identified as low income while I was in college. And I carry all of these identities as I enter this space and in my work. And really, because of my identities and the communities that I come from, I'm deeply committed to equity and justice within education. And yet I know that I've been socialized and I have very colonized ideas about what knowledge is valued, what ways of knowing are valued, particularly within higher education. How we define success is, and ultimately like how this leads to like how I view assessing knowledge and student success. All of that has been rooted in whiteness. And so I've been thinking a lot about how do I start to decolonize what I think about student success, particularly as we talk about assessment today. We want to begin by sharing our positionality and naming our identities, because holding the complexity of having both privileged and marginalized identities is critical to our ability to recognize the ways in which we perpetuate and uphold dominance. We acknowledge that our conversation today is impacted by our multiple identities and paradigms, and that really this shows up in how we engage in assessment work. And so we invite you to think about your own identities and how those impact your ideas of assessment, so that we can attempt to reduce the harm that we may cause students through this work. And then lastly, we just want to say that we enter this space also grounded in our cultural values, which recognize that knowledge is co-constructed. So we invite you to bring your experiences, your knowledge into this space. We are not the holders of knowledge. We really believe that we collectively create knowledge. So again, we invite you to participate either unmuting yourselves or in the chat as we go through this presentation.
Thank you. And so before we start to get into the depths of assessment or equity-centered assessment, we first want to talk about both separately, but also how these two ideas of DEISJ, diversity, inclusion, equity, and social justice, including assessment, come together. And so first, we'd like to define at least what we would understand as DEISJ as diversity, the fact or quality of being different, inclusion, including people from all groups, equity, fairness, and justice for all, and social justice as an act to foster a just society with fair, equitable treatment. In addition, we also look at assessment as any effort to gather, analyze, and interpret evidence, which describes institutional diversity, divisional or agency effectiveness. And so we understand, particularly when we think about assessment, how traditionally thinking of it's rooted in white ideology, and how that starts to impact how we see assessment, how we gather data, and of course share out data. And so what we're wanting to do today is really bring these two ideas together in an idea called equity-minded or centered assessment, particularly because when we think about these two particular thoughts, DEISJ and assessment, these have traditionally been separated. They're separated by offices, so we know we have our DEI offices, our assessment offices, but they're also separated in the literature that we read and how we understand assessment. And so our hope is that we could start to bridge these two ideas and come and center equity-centeredness with respect to assessment ideas.
So, we want to start by naming that our institutions are inherently unjust. So within the context of educational institutions, social justice is aspirational and something that we're working towards. And because our institutions are unjust, and that's something that we're working towards, we have to start with centering equity with the goal of social justice. It's not like we start with the goal of social justice because of all of the ways that higher education and educational systems have been created in this country. So what does it mean really to center equity in our practice? First, equity-minded practitioners and educators must call attention to patterns or inequity in student outcomes, and they take personal responsibility and push for institutional responsibility for the success of their students, while at the same time critically assessing and reassessing their own practices. And then to be really an equity-minded practitioner means we are also race conscious and aware of the social and historical exclusionary practices of higher education. And that's why we're entering this conversation through a Lat Crit lens, so that we can center race in the assessment conversation. And so then how do equity-minded and assessment intersect or bridge together? And there's a few things here. We also, like we said earlier, like this is, some of our own thoughts, and we welcome some of, for you to also share your own thoughts of how these might bridge. But first is, engaging in equity-centered assessment requires us to validate and attend to students' identities and cultural backgrounds. And in the context of this presentation, this means, recognizing that the Latinx student identities, which are not monolithic. Additionally, we must consider how systemic bias and discrimination impact Latinx students' learning and their experiences. And then equity-minded assessment also serves to expose policies and procedures that promote bias, discrimination, and racism. And ultimately, really, this bridge is a call to action, a call to create more inclusive and equitable environments for our students. So much of this work is about building our capacity, our own capacity, as well as our departments or our programs, and then our institutions' capacity to engage in these conversations and really think critically about our assessment work and how we might problematize what we're currently doing. All right, so we want to begin with asking you all to participate in the poll. If you're able and have a phone, we invite you to text. The information is at the top of the screen, but you'll text Fabiola Mora 678 to 37607, and we'll give folks a moment to log on. And the question that we want to pose to you all is, how has or can assessment cause harm? And if you don't have access to log into the poll, feel free to also use the chat box. All right, we're gonna read some of the responses as they're coming in. Marianne and I will kind of alternate, but the first response we have here is, some survey questions can bring up previous or current trauma.
We also have assumptions that a certain type of student performs a certain way. Absolutely. I think that's also in essence when we start to prioritize some types of knowledge, which we'll talk more a bit later.
Then assessment tends results on individual ability, effort, achievement. Yes, right. Instead of acknowledging maybe the systems and the structures that are in place, we place responsibility on the student.
Yeah, assessment can place student identities into box and lean into stereotypes. Yes. And it's surprising how often we actually are doing this, both unconsciously and consciously.
No second chances because it's not rigorous. Yes, right. I think academic rigor is something that is problematic in and of itself, and often impacts disproportionately students of color.
exclude students from assessing educational opportunities? Yes. These are all ways in which we contribute to harm through assessment practices. And I submit that there are a lot other ways that we probably haven't even identified yet, if you will. And it's unfortunate. And I think that's where we're entering this conversation today, is so that we can both become aware of what some of this harm can do or can do, and hopefully challenge it in some capacity within the institutions that we're at. Assessments can focus on the majority and lead to the erasure of some lived experiences. Yes. And we will also be discussing this particular piece as well later in the presentation.
The next one says, because of how it measures students, it may provide incorrect and inappropriate support. Yes, there's a lot missing often in the assessment conversation about how to provide support. And it all, you know, a lot of what we'll talk about too is like who is assessing the data, who's analyzing it, and who's creating the stories about Latinx students. Awesome. We'll feel free to keep adding or put more in the chat box. So we had one more come in.
It looks like standardized assessment instruments not created for by POC. Absolutely. I think this is something that we regularly get into and how we frame our assessment practices, which is critical. And as we kind of go further into our presentation, you'll notice that we're going to start discussing some of these pieces. Additionally to how we're creating assessments, how we're reviewing the data and sharing out that data. And we'll also include some ideas and things that we can all consider. And we're also going to be welcoming everyone here as we co-construct knowledge to also aid in kind of sharing and creating those ideas and how we can move forward in the assessment process. And so as we continue, what we want to do is first build some capacity, if you will, in terms of the LATCRIT framework, which is short for Latinx critical race theory, which is how we're framing our presentation today. And so what I first like to do is provide a overview of LATCRIT. But first, before I do that, I'd also like to share a bit of history in terms of LATCRIT. So Latinx critical race theory scholarship was first developed in 1996. Similarly to critical race theory, its initial grounding was first in critical legal scholarship. And so I think it's important to acknowledge that LATCRIT has been here for years in terms of how we build and look at the Latinx community and experiences. So while it was first grounded in critical legal scholarship, LATCRIT has since expanded into the fields of education, in addition to health and some others. And so kind of going into the overview of LATCRIT theory supplements CRT by addressing issues such as language, immigration, ethnicity, culture, identity, and sexuality. And so it's examining the Latinx community experiences through systems of power and oppression. Similarly to critical race theory, but really, as I mentioned, is really looking at issues that underlie the Latinx community. It is a movement rooted in the marginality and invisibility of Latinx people, particularly in how systems of power work to sustain the dominant narrative, which further perpetuates the marginalization of Latinx communities. And then lastly, LATCRIT is concerned with achieving social justice through systemic change. So we use LATCRIT as a framework for guiding assessment practices with the goal of being able to challenge the dominant discourse on assessment. And so what you'll see as we go through our presentation and we talk about the traditional assessment cycle that I suspect we're all familiar with, we're going to start to deconstruct that through a Latin critical framework, Latinx critical race framework.
So some of the tenets, we want to share some of the tenets of LATCRIT theory. Really, we want to acknowledge that it's used to produce knowledge for and about Latinx people. The first function in evaluation is to understand the Latinx experience through a historical lens that acknowledges the challenges that are relative, as Marianne shared, to identity, language, cultural values, traditional gender roles and expectations, and the impact of immigration, and how the legacy of all of these things impact how those shape the experiences of Latinx communities. And this commitment really requires us to shift our paradigm as it relates to how we consider the assessment cycle and engaging with data. Next is the advancement of transformation and change in and for Latinx communities. So the second function demands that evaluators should have the ability to apply knowledge and understanding about Latinx communities in a way that incites change. This tenet requires us to understand where oppression exists in the Latinx community, in addition to the responsibility we have in making the intersections of identity explicit, as well as problematizing troubling the notions of Latinidad, which critical race scholarship is doing more of recently. Next is the expansion and connection within Latinx communities, and this function demands a commitment to expansion and interconnectedness. Latinx, like we mentioned earlier, is not homogeneous identities. Our experiences are representative of the varied conceptions of what it means to be Latinx, not eliminating the interconnections of our identity. So really, LATCRIT calls us to engage in critical individual and collective reflective processes and work towards the goal of justice for all Latinx people. And then the last one is the cultivation of community and coalitions. And this demands the cultivation of affinity and cooperation among the community of evaluators, focused on knowledge production, transformation, and the commitment to the elimination of oppression and marginalization of Latinx people. So if you've heard the term like nothing about us or for us without us, that essentially captures the essence of LATCRIT theory and how we need to involve the Latinx community in various parts of the assessment cycle.
Thank you, Fabiola. And so before, what we like to do is kind of discuss some general guiding principles for equity-centered assessment. Without critically examining how we practice assessment, what happens is we continue to uphold a system which is historically built to disadvantage the Latinx community in addition to all racial minoritized groups. And so the first one is acknowledges the historical impact of the Latinx community and how it shapes the experiences of Latinx students in higher education. This includes how the historical impact of the Latinx identity, language, culture, values, and traditional gender roles and expectations are impacted. The second one is considers how systemic oppression and dominant institutional narratives affect the learning of Latinx students. specifically examining how whiteness has become normalized in education and validated through our curriculum and classrooms, and how we define learning, which is already some of the things that you all have noted through the poll that Fabiola started us off with. So what this does is it defines learning, or at least the dominant narrative in terms of learning, through a lens of white ideology. And of course, it is met up with little resistance. The third point is interrogates and exposes how social structures such as power, oppression, privilege influence programs and services. And so equity-centered assessment approach centers a student's voice while seeing the process of assessment as a transformation experience that shifts assessment from a tool to demonstrate programmatic effectiveness to a method focused on addressing the inequities of the Latinx community. And so as we continue here, as I mentioned, this assessment cycle probably looks pretty familiar to most of us. But what we want to do today is problematize this assessment cycle through the LATCRIT framework that we've already discussed. And so all of us at some point do engage in this assessment cycle, rather if it's developing learning outcomes for students, the method and data collection or analysis, and of course in how we share our data and reports to others. And so while this traditional assessment cycle does not include the importance of context and impact, what we want to do today is start to break down, if you will, what some of the impact might be as we start to see this assessment cycle through a LATCRIT framework. And so one of the things that I want to do is talk about what we mean by context, but more so in terms of culture. And so in the chat box, if you want to go ahead and use that chat box, what I'd like you to do is identify what is culture. So let me get this open. I'll give you all a couple of minutes to reflect and share in the chat box. How would you define culture? So I think in some ways in how I would define culture is through the shared values or beliefs that we have. And this could be shared values and beliefs in terms of both our department cultures, our institutional cultures, our geographically where we are, also has some form of culture as well. But with that, there's also what we have as societal culture, and that culture is rooted in what we would say is white supremacy, transphobia, heteronormativity. These are all pieces that also define the institutional departmental culture. And so with that, we see that those pieces and how we define culture within our institutions start to impact in how we see assessment, but it also contributes to the power and oppression that we also experience through that traditional assessment cycle. And so with that said, it's so important that when we enter these conversations in terms of assessment, that we're always conscious of what culture is shaping our narrative in terms of how we're developing our outcomes and sharing the results of any assessments that we do within our offices.
Thanks, Marianne. So I think when we're, talking about Latinx populations, we must think about how cultural values work in tandem with Lat Crit theory. They can't be absent from the conversation. And oftentimes, like, values that come from Latinx communities are not valued within higher education. And so we really need to think about, like, what's missing in terms of values and cultural context. And so, traditionally the assessment cycle, like Marianne said, doesn't consider these things in the assessment process. Campus Labs provides us with this graphic for embedding equity throughout the assessment cycle and centers the importance of context, of multiple lenses in the process, the use of multiple approaches to assessment creation and analyzing data, as well as the consideration of positionality, power, agency, and voice. There's a book that's coming out that's going to be about becoming an aware assessor. And really, this means that we need to consider our power, positionality, the agency and voice of assessors, of the participants, and the recipients of the data and the results in our assessment work. And when we talk about engaging stakeholders, this includes students, campus partners, community partners, and often when we're talking about Latinx populations, there's not a lot of community engagement in assessment work. Often research and data and assessment and evaluation are missing the voices from the community that they're trying to assess. And so really we need to think about how do we bring in the community, the Latinx community, as we're assessing and sharing results. And I also think about how do we bring them in before we share the results, like what are the stories that they want told about their own communities that are often not considered. And that, we need to consider all stakeholders in the design, the administration, and the sharing of the results. Additionally, we also need to consider campus context-specific approaches. So what works at one institutional type with the particular student population may not be appropriate at another. So while we're happy to share the ways in which our institution, CSU, has begun doing equity-minded assessment, and we've started a working group on socially just assessment, it's important to consider the different contexts of each institution. And I know that there are a lot of folks from MSU Denver on this call, which is a Hispanic serving institution. And I would imagine that the conversations around assessments there and using Lat Crit framework are even more critical because of the populations that you're serving. While it's important at CSU, we don't have the same numbers of students and our population looks different. So I think it's really important just to think about the context of the institution and think about what's appropriate based on the students that you're serving. And then last, we must draw on non-dominant approaches and methods and identify ways to shift power dynamics and elevate the lived experiences of students by learning from other epistemologies. And I think someone commented about that in the poll. So things like universal design, indigenous research methods and pedagogy, wisdom traditions, critical theory, which includes critical race theory. And we also want to name that this work, and we said it at the beginning, but I think it's really important because Campus Labs, and I just want to name it here, Campus Labs is coming out with a lot of recent work, but we need to acknowledge that this work around critiquing research and assessment comes from communities of color and scholars of color who have been doing this work for a long time, even though it's now coming more into the assessment world. So we just want to make sure that we name that this is kind of where it started. So now we're going to share some examples of how we could use Lat Crit throughout the assessment cycle as we work with Latinx students.
Thanks, Fabiola. So the first two areas that we want to talk about is, of course, step 1 and 2 of the assessment cycle, which is determining outcomes and also considering methods and collection of data. And so I'm not going to go through all of these, and we're happy to share these ideas as well. And we also recognize that this is not an exhaustive list of how to really start to think about the LAT-CRIT framework as we see assessment. And so I welcome y'all to share more ideas through the chat box, or feel free to also unmute yourselves if you have any other thoughts in terms of these next steps that we take within the assessment cycle. And so the first one, determining the outcomes, some of the key points that I would point out is including students in drafting outcomes and engage students in mapping learning outcomes to learning experiences. And so in terms of this particular one, what I would share is it's so critical that we involve students in every step of the way, particularly in determining how our outcomes are developed, how we conceptualize truth and power, which is epistemology, can influence how we frame our learning outcomes, and how we also can privilege some types of knowledge over others by excluding or disqualifying some forms of knowledge. We are prioritizing that dominant narrative in terms of learning. And so I think as we start to bring students into the development of student outcomes or learning outcomes, what we're doing is honoring that the students are the key stakeholders in this, as they should actually be involved in the development of those as well. And so the next one I would also mention here is evaluating learning outcomes frameworks, as I've already mentioned, through dominant epistemologies, ensuring that our outcome frameworks is equity minded and includes the experiences of marginalized populations. And so involving racially minoritized students in the development of learning outcomes provides them a platform to control their own experience, as opposed to us coming in and saying, this is what we hope you will learn. I think sometimes we need to trust our students in terms of let them bring their knowledge, let them bring their experience and be involved in that transaction of learning. The next step in the assessment cycle is, of course, methods and the collection of data. And so the first one being engages students in determining methods for showcasing their learning, engage students in the design of the methods or tool, and solicit student feedback on the questions and prompts developed. And so this particular step in taking an equity-centered approach uses reflection as a form of implementation, such as the use of narratives, storytelling methods to increase opportunities for students to share their stories and experiences. In addition to, there's focus groups. So these are different methods that we could actually be taking, as opposed to, I think, the traditional methods that we take in, particularly when working with the Latinx communities. And so through using narratives and storytelling to increase opportunities for student stories and opportunities to learn, what we're doing is focusing on the student rather than just taking in and breaking down the data that we get just into tidbits. And so what we're doing is honoring these student stories and experiences as a way to think about the phenomenon in question. The next one is considers multiple methods. As we've already mentioned, storytelling, rubrics, e-portfolios, narratives. We could also indicate focus groups as well. And then lastly, examines and evaluates the language for any type of bias. And so that is one of the things, I think one of the first steps to an equity-centered approach is really looking at the language that we're using within our evaluations or assessments. I'm gonna pause there because that is a lot of talking. And I'm gonna welcome anyone to share in the chat box any questions they might have, or if you also have any other ideas on how we could approach the determination of outcomes and methods, I welcome you to unmute yourselves if you like.
Can I share something? Let me find
Absolutely.
everybody. I had to go through the screen share. So I was a former teacher, and in the K-12 setting, you know, it's always this really interesting phenomenon, right? Where kids all of a sudden miss a skill early on, and then it just keeps perpetuating itself. And nobody actually stops to say, hey, this thing is missing. This kid never learned X, Y, or Z, right? And then people just keep plowing through. At the university level, you know, this is something that I think about with even something like medical students, right? We pass them, you know, sometimes science classes are curved, right? So they only know 60% of the information that they need to know. And I'm thinking, I don't want them operating on me, you know, but this is like the weird thing, right? That we keep perpetuating this horrible inequity that if we actually want solid adults with higher thinking level skills, how do we really know that that's what we're getting at the end, right? So I don't see a lot of mastery level experiences, meaning this is where you're starting, this is how far you've moved along.
Mm-hmm.
So say a student fails a class, right? But they got 50% of the information. We don't have a starting point to say, okay, you have this, you're at 50%, let's move you to the next part, right? And assess where you're starting and take you where you need to go. Higher ed is just not designed that way. So I'm wondering, is anybody looking into that, you know, in terms of not having a kid repeat a class 3 or 4 times and getting the same thing when all they need is to focus on this particular skill or this particular knowledge or facts for that matter, you know, in the sciences. So I'm curious to know, like, what are you seeing in higher ed? Because I know that that was missing in the K-12 environment. And now people call it, you know, standard-based, you know, grading or mastery experiences. So I'm curious to know what the conversation is in higher ed right now.
I think that same experience that you are sharing in terms of the K through 12 is definitely happening in higher ed as well. And I think, at least from my perspective, and I welcome anyone here to join this conversation, is oftentimes we focus on the student. We're saying the student isn't learning this. The student is not capturing this information, but we're not looking at the system. We're not looking at the information that's being delivered. And I think that's what starts, I think that's like the first step of looking at this particular issue, is not placing the responsibility on the student, but placing the responsibility on the institution, on the instructor, the faculty member, and us looking at what we are doing that is impacting this phenomenon, if you will.
What implications does that have for once they go into the workforce though? If we put the onus on the system?
Can you say that one more time? You were cutting out on my computer just a little.
What implications does that have for the workforce? If the student hasn't learned how to kind of figure out where they're at and where they need to go, once they get into the workforce, they're pushed out of the workforce because they don't know how to do that still, you see? So I'm wondering, like, what supports are available, or for both, right? I think for the individual and for the system.
And I think I would, you know, I think that that's a really great point. And, you know, when we I'm speaking like particularly for higher ed, and I welcome like more K through 12. But when students get into our universities, we admit them as they are. So we have a responsibility to get them where they need to be in order to enter the job force. Now that means that we need to look at our systems, we need to look at our curriculum, we need to know what's happening that students are falling behind. And because we're not like, for example, math, at CSU, math courses have high DFW, and the majority of students who are failing beginner math courses at CSU are disproportionately students of color. Now, we can't like place blame on students and have them repeat courses over and over. This is historically like what we are seeing. It's not a new phenomenon. We have to think about like what's happening in our math department, what's happening with faculty, what's happening with the curriculum, because we have made a commitment to admit these students and serve them where they are. So I think, you know, when I think about, yes, we can offer like student support, but until we can address the root issues of what's causing them to be left behind, it's always going to be this cycle of them being left behind. And so I think when we're talking about assessment through the higher ed lens, it's really using the data to point out the inequities in the systems that need to be addressed so that all students can be successful. Dr. V, I know you were gonna add.
Thanks, Fabiola. You know, in some of my research in K through 12, I have found that a lot of our high school teachers, and this speaks to what you just said, Fabiola, a lot of our high school teachers and counselors approach our students of color from a cultural deficit thinking, and Valenzuela talks a lot about that cultural deficit thinking. So a case in point was a young Latina who had a 3.8 who wanted to take additional courses, but her counselor, who was also her math teacher, said, no, you really need to have more work-focused classes. And so rather than take an additional math class and additional language class, you need to focus on some skill building. And so encouraged her to take cosmetology, which is fine if that's what a student wants to do, but that's not what this student wanted to do. So perpetuated that culturally deficit fault of, I don't expect this young, case in point, Latina to do well in math. And so consequently, it is a systems issue, and we have to do a lot to teach our counselors and teachers K through 12 to not focus on that cultural deficit thinking, that white ideology that you're talking about, you and Marianne. So Dr. Garcia, I think that's an important thing to consider, because as you said, they pass them on. And then when they do get to the university, they're struggling. And so then it is up to us. We have a responsibility in higher ed to support those students to learn more, to then be successful. Sorry,
I guess I didn't mean it that way. I think what I meant was, and I'll give you a really good case in point. I'm actually homeschooling my kid because of COVID, and it became too complicated. But one of the biggest, my fourth grader, one of the biggest gaps I saw, I'm thinking, I saw this in our teachers, in our future teachers too, but they never got it because they had never been exposed to a way of knowing what they know and actually thinking about what is it that I don't know, right? That metacognitive skills. So my fourth grader, we were working through some things, and I said, there are some things you have to just build automaticity for, just your facts, and she was like, what does that even mean, Mom? And so then we started working, and then when she saw it, when it hit her, she's like, oh, that's what it means, right? This is stuff I don't even have to think about because I know it already. Our college kids don't have that, right? And so when it comes to certain things, and then of course, critical thinking, when do you use, when do you add, when do you, all that kind of stuff. And I'm thinking, our teachers didn't have this when I had them at the college level. And so there is a part of me that right now, when I hear conversations with private schools, for example, and they say, oh, our kids are, they're in school right now, they're having an opportunity to practice those critical thinking skills. And I'm thinking, where's the big gap that we have, right? Because I feel like learning how to learn is just a basic life skill. And so I'm just curious to know, what does that mean for university professors to really truly teach their students to learn without putting the onus on the student, but at the same time, building capacity in them to know when to say, it's not okay for you to put me in a cosmetology class because I know that I am proficient in these things and my next level is this. But they don't know that, you see? So there is a gap somehow. And I feel like there's kind of a back and forth, but I'm just wondering, because in the workforce, nobody's going to be vouching for them, right? And so there's a part of me that's like, how do they advocate for themselves, yet understand that it is part of a system that is meant to oppress them?
Mhm. No, I think we're saying basically the same thing. You know, we want them to have critical learning skills and then to use them. And again, it's that dominant ideology that says, you know, this is what you need to do. And I think also a value in our own culture to respect authority, but also to say we want our children to be successful. So we have to blend that in there too. So yeah, I appreciate what you're saying.
Absolutely. I appreciate this conversation that we're having. I do want to honor our time that we have here and continue through the remaining part that we have, but we will be staying on afterwards, or at least I can stay on afterwards, or maybe we could continue this conversation or answer any more questions that anyone does have. The main point that I'd like to, did you want to share something, Fabiola? The main point that I would like to point out, at least for these 2 steps in the assessment cycle, is that including a student's voice is essential through this because it acknowledges their rightful status as experts about the student experience and honors their agency to guide and influence data collection and analysis. Through this, the assessment process is seen as a change process used to dismantle the structures of oppression rather than a transactional process that is only concentrated on the outputs. And so that's one of the key things that I would say is a takeaway for these 2 particular areas.
Thanks, Marianne. The other thing that I like really hate to bring it up here, but I just want to put it out there because I think it could help with the last conversation, is there's this idea of the science of learning, and I don't know if folks are familiar with it. But at CSU, there are faculty who are engaging in this work, but it's also important to problematize that because it does not take identity or systems of power, privilege, and oppression into consideration at all. It places the full responsibility of learning on the students without acknowledging, like, when we think about higher ed and how oppressive it is for some of our most marginalized students, like, the environment matters on students' ability to learn. The resources, the access to food, to security, to housing, like, there's lots of things that impact how a student learns. So that's just something that I wanted to add there, that there is an idea of science of learning, but I think it's important to be really critical about how that's used with students. The next part of the cycle is analyze data. The first part is it's really important that we disaggregate data to understand the equity gaps for Latinx students and the intersections of their multiple identities. So often when we see, data, we either disaggregate it by race, and that's kind of the end. We don't go deeper and disaggregate, like, by race and generation status and income status and gender. Like, how do we do more intersectional analysis to really understand where the gaps exist? And while it's important to engage in multiple types of data analysis, both within group and across groups, we should not hold white student experiences as the benchmark for comparison, which is done in a lot of assessment work. So when we draw comparison across groups, we need to contextualize the results in the student experience. For example, not all students have the same resources, access, or experiences. And then not all statistical analysis approaches require a large N, right? I think when we think about statistics and, at CSU until recently, I'll just use this example, our Native Indigenous students were not counted in the data because the population is so small. They were completely erased from any conversation around equity And so discussions around having enough responses can really silence historically marginalized populations. And I want to read the quote at the bottom that says, through dummy coding procedures, the average score of one categorical group, usually the dominant social group, men, whites, etc., becomes a reference group. Findings for other groups are then interpreted in relation to the reference group, making the experience of the non-dominant group understood only within the context of the dominant group's outcome. This practice leads to a perpetuation of the deficit narratives of students of color underachievement, which I think Dr. B was talking about, right? When we look at data, this is usually how it's presented. It's like white students and students of color, and they're always compared to each other instead of doing within group comparisons. And so we need to be careful not to be erasing the experiences of our Latinx students when we're only making sense of their experiences as they relate to white students, because we know they're having very different experiences on our campuses. The next part is use and share results. And in this section, we're really talking about how do we really be intentional in our approach to data analysis and sharing. We need to consider how you may be writing results from a deficit-based orientation, and prior to data collection, really identify the use of the results for action. Why are you doing this? And asking yourself those questions like why you, why now, what's the purpose? Consider who has the power to determine if the results are valid and accurate, and how data reports and summaries will be written and shared. So historically, we just want to name that research, data, and evaluation has been weaponized in our country to other and dehumanize Black, Indigenous, and other communities of color and inflict violence. That's literally how research and assessment came to be in this country. So we need to be super intentional about how we approach analysis and how it is shared. Once we put something out there, we cannot control how it will be used. So we really need to think about the ways that Latinx data, whatever we're doing around Latinx students, how we're using it, how we're sharing it, because once it's out there, it can be weaponized against Latinx communities. And ultimately, data do not speak for themselves. They are given voice by those who interpret them. And so we really need to spend time examining kind of our own internalized oppression, our own biases, all of the ways that we have just been taught to look at Latinx students through a deficit lens, because we are the ones that are going to contribute to that, or we can be the ones to disrupt those narratives. Are there other things or questions that you think that we should be added when you think about analyzing data and using and sharing results?
I don't know if I necessarily have anything to add, but I wanted to provide an example of maybe disaggregating data. That's okay.
Yes.
So I'll make it short. So I have a lot of students in my program who are multilingual or known as English language learners. And before I looked at my data, I didn't know what their needs were once they got into their college classes. So I was seeing okay, they were successful in their first year English class. So that means that they're going to be fine moving forward. And that's not the case. I had a lot of multilingual students who just did not have enough support in their other classes that are heavy in writing. And so now having to work backwards to figure out, okay, how do we provide the support so that they do feel supported with their essay writing and reading as well, so that they're able to keep up in their classes.
I think I would add, earlier you had have students determine outcomes together, construct outcomes. I think transparency to match the outcomes to where the student is right now. And I think that that goes back to what I was trying to say in terms of your own progression. And I think it gets to what Alejandra just said right now is then you know where the gaps are, right? But there's kind of a, as an instructor, you know where the students' gaps are, but we don't get a, hey, keep working on this type of, thing to make sure you're ready for this writing, these type of writing assignments. Or, we didn't have much time to cover this in class, but please keep an eye out because you're gonna need these in these type of classes, right? So it's more it is a plan, but there's kind of a realization that you're not going to learn everything in one class, but then also kind of like, where do you even go if you have a gap, right? And so that's, I think that's something I hear in what I just, in Alejandra's comment, and in what I was trying to say earlier. It's really making that connection to A goes to B. Obviously, it's not always that linear, but with math, for example, it can be that linear. And with writing too, there's kind of like for me, when I write, I always add S's in my in my brain, thinking in Spanish, go to English. Or I transpose letters, like I put, instead of from, I put forum or something like that. So if I know to look for those type of errors, then that just helps me, kind of at least keep on the lookout that I might be making those mistakes. So I think that matching, I don't see it anywhere in terms of like that direct connection between if students are contributing, they can also have a say-so in terms of what the outcome looks like and where they're at.
I think that is one of the things I know Fabiola, myself and another colleague and I have been talking about is involving students in the creation and development of learning outcomes shouldn't just stop there. I think we also have to think about how are we mapping our activities, our programs to these particular learning outcomes, because what can happen is, yes, we say these are our learning outcomes, but if we have nothing connecting to it, then we're not actually responding to those. And so I think that's where it becomes essential that we start to map out even further our programs and activities to ensure that we are creating experiences that will actually lead up to those outcomes.
Any other thoughts or questions? I did want to answer a question in the chat box that says, do you have suggestions for asking students to participate in the development of assessment while respecting the value of their time? And yeah, I think, and I think Tisha responded to that, right? Like, how do you incentivize students? From when you're starting your learning outcomes, like how do you pay students for their time? I think it's really important that we think about, what does it mean to compensate students for the way that we're hoping that they engage with our programs. And so whether that's like paying them, I see here gift cards, grocery store, like food gift cards. Particularly, I think with our work, it's important. We're in a TRIO we have a couple of TRIO programs and a program that serves undocumented students. A majority of them also identify as first gen and low income. And so when we think about asking students to contribute to this work, we need to think about how do we compensate them appropriately so that we're not also contributing to this like cycle of unpaid labor that they are having to navigate both in here. When we talk about internships, there's lots of ways that students support our work that is in unpaid ways. That is inequitable and that sometimes keeps students out from engaging in these opportunities.
Thank you. The last thing we want to leave everyone with is a quote by Dr. Ben Simon. Act on equity findings, the authentic exercise of equity and equity mindedness requires explicit attention to structural inequity and institutionalized racism that demands system changing responses. And so I think what we're getting at, like in terms of our presentation, is applying a critical lens and practicing equity-centered assessment provides opportunities to further equity by exposing the factors that serve as barriers to success for our Latinx community here. And so what we hope to do is continue this conversation, not just through COSIAL, but within the institutions that we're at, and that we're asking these questions in terms of how are we developing outcomes, and then of course the other 3 steps within that assessment cycle. Otherwise, what we tend to do is just continue to perpetuate, which leads to the continuation of and oppression of our Latinx communities. And so what we want to do is continue with a few questions that we have in our next slide, and hopefully use the remaining, I think, 15 minutes that we have to be in conversation with each other in terms of the questions listed on here. And so that first question, where and how does your assessment language reflect culturally acquired knowledge and perpetuate racism? Or if you also want to respond to any of the other 2, I also welcome that as well.
I can provide an example. So for example, in DPS or in like K through 12, we use AccuPlacer T to determine if a student is ready for college level courses. And so for my program, we use language that says, you must be college ready in English and math in order to be in the program, right? And that's specifically tied to several different assessments that a student can take to quote unquote become college ready.
I would completely agree with that. I think up until maybe a few years ago, even community colleges use some of those same assessments, AccuPlacer, and there's some others as a way to determine like what is college appropriate. And I think one of the things that, you know, I would argue, and I had these discussions with leaders at the institution I was previously at, is who's determining that benchmark, right? I think it goes back to how we're prioritizing white knowledge, if you will, in terms of all of these assessments that have benchmarks. And so if you don't meet that, we're not acknowledging other forms of knowledge or even learning.
And I just put this in the chat box for the folks are not familiar with Tia Brown McNair. She has work around like how do we shift from this narrative about students being college ready to institutions and schools being student ready. So like how do we meet students where they're at as they're entering our institutions? Which I think at CSU we read as a whole community several years ago, and also brought Dr. Tia Brown McNair to work with our faculty and our staff across academic and student affairs to help us think about how do we shift some of that language. Any other thoughts on that one? Or the next question that we have, and feel free to jump in wherever, is how are senior leaders, faculty, and staff educated about racial inequity as a structural problem rather than a cultural problem attributed to minoritized populations, and the need to reconsider equity in the socio-historical context of exclusionary practices at your campus and in higher education?
So I have like a technical question about if you're developing, outcomes and assessments. Obviously, that drives what instruction is going to take place. And when the selections of readings and the selections of textbooks are problematic to begin with, right? How do they go together in this particular conversation? Just because I know that, some professors are in their ways, they want X, Y, and Z readings, period. Is that part of like the system of transformation that's happening here, where students can propose readings, for example, or they can propose, let's explore this author or that author, or is it just like you're bound within this system, too bad, And I feel like that's kind of another layer to the conversation. And I'm just curious to know with the second question, how that connects with the work that's been done with assessment is actually curriculum design and how that can impact outcomes.
I can share like from CSU. So there's a working group that's looking at socially just assessment and working on the university learning outcomes. So when folks like step back to look at the university learning outcome design, there are actually no students involved in the creation of university learning outcomes, which is like super problematic. But no one had asked like, how are students' voices even considered in developing these learning outcomes, particularly right for our general required courses. And in many courses beyond that, like what's the accountability of departments and faculty to include student voice in the development? And as of right now, there hasn't been, but this committee has folks from the Vice President for Diversity's office, our institutional research and assessment, as well as academic and student affairs. And the university learning outcome process is about to be redone, as well as the program review. So thinking about what are things that can be infused in those processes and those systems to hold faculty accountable. And the Vice President for Diversity is also thinking about how do they kind of advance that work as they work more closely with academic affairs. But it's not until just at the beginning of this year that people started asking questions like, where is student voice? How is that connected to what faculty are doing? How do we hold faculty accountable to the outcomes and including students in that process? And so I feel like we're really far behind in terms of like what you're asking. Like there's a lot of work that needs to be done to get to a place where like institutionally and systemically, we're doing this and we are centering equity, because right now like that hasn't been the case. The other thing I was going to add here is that, I think it also requires like institutions like faculty and staff to have a willingness to do this work. And so what has been really awesome at CSU is that there are folks in like these critical departments who can influence like and create systemic change, who are on board. Like our Vice President for Assessment and Research, the Director of the Institutional Research, like they are like critical. They're reading like things around critical race theory. They're the folks that pull data and tell the stories. Like they are willing to have like some of these harder conversations. They are the ones like meeting with our math department to talk about inequities in math. So, I think building the capacity of our senior leaders and faculty and building coalitions with folks across different areas like is really important to move this work forward. And there has to be a willingness from the institution or from the school to want to do better. I think that, it can be really hard to like continue to push and just hit a wall over and over and over. And so at CSU, that's how it started. It started as like, we're not getting anywhere. So we started to form our own little like group that started working on these things. And then each of us like started pulling like different people into the conversation that we knew like could engage and wanted to engage and could create change. So I think like organizing, which comes from like communities of color, is also like critical to doing this work.
Excellent. Thank you, Fabiola. I know that we are kind of ending our time here right now, but I welcome if anyone has other questions related to this presentation or just questions in general that you're experiencing at your own institution. We welcome those.
I'll talk. I've been very quiet. I just wanted to say thank you for this presentation. The reason I was in it is because I think assessment is something that's very important and something that within the area that I work in and Tisha works in, which is our Center for Equity and Student Achievement. We really try to do a lot in every facet of this work. And sometimes I think it's a little bit like, like, okay, I know we're doing it, but how do we know if we're doing it correctly? And also where's the institution when it comes to this as well? And some things are unknown sometimes, but I think we're doing good work. And I think for me, I don't know, I can't speak for Tisha, but this also seems a little like not rewarding. What's the word I'm thinking of? Like I think we're on the right track to doing this work. So I think about my own personal like surveys. I know assessment isn't just surveys, but I feel like that's a big one. And that I really try to put myself in the student shoes when I create surveys and whether what I'm getting out of it is something that's going to help them, right? So if I'm posting questions, it's questions around what do you need to get prepared to coming to school, right? I work with first year students. So do you have a laptop? Do you have a workstation, especially now during COVID times? And if they don't, then we find a solution to do that. So I think this is why I love the work that we do within like academic success. Yeah, very important. So thank you for this presentation. Sorry I didn't answer a lot of the questions. I think sometimes I get really caught up in the wording of questions and super academic. I'm just like, I don't know if I'm going to answer it correctly. So, but thank you both.
Thank you, Evelyn. I'm the same way. I get caught up in the wording and so forth of my questions. One of the things I would add, at least in response to your comment, I know that in the past I've used the CAS standards, and I've never really actually been a fan of CAS standards because nowhere within CAS for the past like decade did it include anything in terms of diversity, equity, and inclusion. There was a lot on assessment, but no lens in how we see assessment through a critical way. Up until recently, in their 10th edition, they have actually added a DEI piece to their program reviews. And so I would definitely encourage, looking at that. It's something that I've really appreciated in this latest edition that they've created. And it also looks like Fabiola also added some other comments related to Dr. Gina Garcia's work. Absolutely.
Yeah, the only thing that I would add there is thinking about, I think there are a lot of folks on here who said, I work in student success, is really thinking about like, what does student success mean? How are you bringing students into like defining what student success means, or are you using your own definitions of student success? I'm sorry, my headphones died, and so if you can hear my coworker, I'm sorry. There she goes. So yeah, and Dr. Gina Garcia talks about like, can liberation be an outcome if our student success metrics are so rooted in whiteness? So typically when we think about student success, we're talking about persistence, retention, and graduation rates. But where in that is room for students' voices to define what success means to them. And so, you know, in the AAC, we've started asking questions. We started asking students to let us know what student success means to them, and then trying to form our outcomes based on that. So beyond just the things that, you know, are usually valued in education, which are the numbers, like how do we bring the stories, experiences? And the number one thing that students have said over the last couple of years is that the measure of success for them through their college journey will be happiness. And there is nothing about happiness in any learning outcome that we've ever had. And that has been like probably 90% of students say that they measure their success in college by their happiness. Not GPAs or graduations or jobs or careers or anything that we think is important. It has been happiness for our students. And again, our students are first and low income, students of color, and undocumented students. And so I think taking a step back to even think about like, what are we talking about when we think about student success, and what does that mean to students themselves is really important. I know that we're over time, so we just want to say thank you so much for engaging in this conversation. And Marianne and I can stay on for a little bit if folks want to continue or have additional questions. But otherwise, we appreciate you all and your time and energy in engaging with us today.
Yes, thank you all for joining us. And we definitely look forward to continuing this conversation and hopefully just learning from one another through this process.
Thank you so much. Great information.